Great. Well, good afternoon and welcome to CSIS for our event on ensuring U.S. leadership in low Earth orbit. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to just give very brief opening remarks to sort of preview some of the issues that we'll go into more depth with. So we're here today because commercial low Earth orbit satellite is one of the central instruments of national power in the 21st century. The nation that leads in this sector will have control over global communications, enabling them to provide ubiquitous, cutting-edge military communications and intelligence capabilities to deliver high-speed internet to rural areas, for disaster relief, for all kinds of other use cases. And that nation will also be in a position to define the rules and norms of space and really have a leg up in that way. So ensuring U.S. leadership in this domain is absolutely essential to keeping our economy strong and our nation safe. While the U.S. currently has a lead in LEO, which is great, and we have a large number of LEO launches planned, the competition in the next few years is going to be very intense. Over the next decade, the People's Republic of China plans to launch over 40,000 LEO satellites. To put that in perspective, that's 5 times the number of active satellites that are in orbit today. So we've seen a lot of rhetoric in recent years, including from scholars like me, regarding how we're facing a number of Sputnik moments where it's used as a metaphor, that there's an AI Sputnik moment or a quantum Sputnik moment. But I would suggest we also have a Sputnik moment, meaning that we're embarking on another space race. The difference in this case being that it's really commercial providers, and the difference being that the PRC has a lot more economic power and ability to subsidize its satellite operators than the USSR would have. If we fail to adapt, and that's what we're here to talk about today, we could really lose our advantage in the next 3 to 10 years, which would be quite significant. So how does the U.S. respond? Well, we have to act decisively. It begins with the dynamism of our private sector. American companies have pioneered the space economy, including LEO. We have the best innovators in the world. They're the engine of space leadership. But it's important that we note that the government plays an absolutely pivotal role in enabling space activity. So we need a whole-of-nation strategy that harnesses both Silicon Valley and Washington and everything in between. The government has to have a clear vision that includes things like streamlining regulations, speeding up approvals, investing in R&D, procuring space systems in a way that speeds them up, cuts red tape, and also guarantees a really diverse and competitive, robust market of U.S. companies, and that also champions our interests internationally. And we're going to talk about many of those things. So America, and this is and other things, America and its allies and partners can outcompete any rival, but only if we all, and especially the administration, continues to prioritize space policy at the highest levels and empowers our innovators to do what they do best. Obviously 2 areas, right? Domestic, international. Domestically, we need to update our rules and streamline them at home. And so that includes, for example, FCC in cooperation with NTIA, reforming how they authorize and oversee space systems, from faster FCC licensing to improved federal, non-federal coordination to match the scale and dynamism of the private sector. And fortunately, several transformative efforts are already underway, and we're going to be discussing them today. Internationally, beyond the U.S., U.S. leadership requires engaging globally and shaping the international environment to the advantage of the U.S. and our allies and partners. We face several challenges and opportunities there. One of the main challenges is the EU's proposed EU Space Act, which would impose onerous restrictions almost exclusively on U.S. LEO operators in an effort potentially to create European champions. So it's absolutely critical for the administration to prioritize that issue, to engage diplomatically. Of course, we want opportunities for all countries in low Earth orbit, but we need fair, harmonized rules with the EU, US, and other countries. And so that's really important. And beyond those sorts of issues, the US needs to step up its diplomacy in international venues, especially at the 2027 World Radio Conference, or WARC 27, as those in space and telecom call it, where critical decisions on spectrum allocations and rules for satellite are going to be made, including one of the hallmark issues is going to be equivalent power flux density, or EPFD, which will have enormous implications for US LEO operators. So we need to build coalitions with allies to ensure that the global rules governing spectrum and in other areas align with US interests and technical realities. Fortunately, here too, the FCC and TIA, in cooperation with the State Department, are exercising leadership and playing an indispensable role. So I think, in many ways, we're in a good position. But today is about how do we build on some of that momentum from those reforms that I was talking about. So with that, I'll introduce our fireside chat. We were originally slated to have two government guests. Adam Cassidy from NTIA was going to join us. Unfortunately, he was pulled away by urgent government business. But this means I get to interrogate Jay for a full 30 minutes. And then if I get him in trouble, he can just blame Adam. So it'll be great. So we'll be doing a fireside chat first with Jay Schwartz, who's chief of the FCC's Space Bureau, and has just really extensive experience both inside and outside of government on telecommunications issues, has a number of really interesting perspectives, having dealt with regulation, is an incredible economist, and so sees things from that angle, and really has had a great role in terms of working under Chairman Carr to try to spearhead some of these reforms, which the FCC has acted on remarkably quickly. So with that, we'll get started. Great. Can everybody? Great. So I think we should probably start by speaking frankly, which is to say that the Space Bureau, or the International Bureau before that, over the years before you took over, has had backlogs. It's varied over time, and that was even before we had this explosion in LEO constellations. So it'd be really helpful for you to talk a bit about sort of the origin of what you're doing, and also what the FCC is proposing to do in order to address that challenge.
Yeah, thanks. Great to be here, Matt. And Matt and I go kind of way back, right? At least a decade or so. Yeah. So good to see you. I think a central word that we've been using across the FCC this year has been build. And Chairman Carr talks a lot about his build agenda and building infrastructure. And certainly he sees the space infrastructure that we're trying to build as really key to his agenda. So that frames everything that we're trying to do. And you made a really good point that the volume of work that's been coming through Space Bureau has increased significantly. Certainly several hundred times, or several 100% increase in the last few years. And so one of the key tasks that I see us as having is figuring out how to scale the regulatory system to what's happening in the industry. And you're right, there's been a backlog, and that's really been one of the key things that we've been focusing on, so that we can make sure that private companies are able to build that infrastructure, right? You mentioned China, and probably many of you guys are familiar with Dan Wing's recent book, Breakneck, right? And kind of the bumper sticker phrase from that is, China's run by engineers, America's run by lawyers. And let's be honest, something that China knows how to do is build, right? And that's, you might disagree with various elements of the book, but I think we can all agree on that. And so we live in the United States. I think there's lots of great characteristics about the United States, but one of the things I think that is worth asking ourselves is, are there ways that we can frame our regulatory models to where it makes it easier for folks to build? And so a lot of what we've been doing, and maybe we can talk more specifically in a moment about the what we call our modernization efforts, but one of the things we've been doing is kind of asking ourselves that question, or at least I've certainly been thinking of it this way: how can we maybe be a little bit more like engineers than lawyers in how we frame our regulatory model?
Yeah, so that's helpful. I think we want to go into the rules. It might be helpful though to take a step back, because I did talk a bit about the U.S.'s position, but also the challenges that we're facing, and try to describe the stakes. But how does Chairman Carr, how does the FCC see it in terms of the coming years, and what it would mean for the U.S. to maintain leadership versus lose it?
So last night I was watching with my kids a documentary on Rome, and they were talking about the Roman road, right, and the infrastructure, and how that both provided the ability to project military strength, but also obviously support commerce. And so I think we can use that analogy a little bit, right, and say that what the United States wants to do is build that infrastructure for space. And has so many different components, whether it's the communication systems or PNT, or putting refueling at Lagrange points, or building the things for us to ultimately do more stuff on the moon or Mars, right? So you're building out all of that infrastructure. And you want to do that because there's incredible military and economic benefit that once you've built that infrastructure, compounds and grows over time, right? And that's what it means for our country and the free world to be able to build that infrastructure and build it fast, so we can do those things, and so our children can benefit from that.
Yeah, and I would imagine another aspect of it, in terms of how you look at it, is that then that infrastructure reflects our values, right? That's openness, that's free flow of information, that's the ability for people to really have control and autonomy in their own lives, right? That in some sense, it's not just the infrastructure, it's the values that it represents, if the U.S. and allies and partners control it.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, it may be helpful for the audience to learn a bit more about the specific reforms that you propose. Those of us who have been in FCC world for 15 years know Part 25 very well. A lot of arcane rules in that. And you're
probably you wrote some of those arcane rules.
I did write some of those, and would like to go back and change some of them if I could. But you're doing that. So, but you're proposing to have a really new clean slate in terms of Part 100, and to really identify those applications and those requests that should not require any time, right? Because they just automatically comply with the rules. But it may be helpful for you to walk through your thinking and what you're proposing to do.
Yeah, great. Be happy to. I'm really proud of the team for putting together this proposal over much of 2025. And we call it the Licensing Modernization Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. But you're absolutely right. And I think this is a good example of that engineering mindset versus lawyer mindset, maybe, and how we've tried to implement it, or at least in this proposal, implement that. And so you started to touch on it. One of the things that we we recognized as we looked at Part 25, and we're trying to figure out what do we need to do here, is there were so many pieces of it that are highly subjective. So the applicant has to put in subjective information, and then the lawyers, if you want to put that, have to review that subjective information. And so if we're trying to increase speed and we're trying to increase predictability for how your application is going to be handled, that's not the way to do it. And so there will obviously be many places where the FCC and Space Bureau needs to make a policy decision on something that somebody wants to do. But what there is also, there's also many cases where someone is asking to do something squarely within the rules, and those are the sorts of things we want to say, the commission's already said that's within the rules, and so you should be expedited. And so we created a framework. I say that the three things we're trying to achieve are speed, predictability, and flexibility. And then we tried to build a framework that would do that. So took I think a very first principles approach. We, first of all, completely redesigned the application. And what we did was we said, you're going to certify, along these various points. Are you going to comply with that or not? And those more or less align with what the commission has said is inbounds and out of bounds. So are you going to comply with those? Yes or no? If you say no, that doesn't mean you're rejected. All that means is that's the area that we're going to go and take a closer look. So we called this the licensing assembly line. And we called it that because at least I think of the application moving down an assembly line, and as long as you just are, in the rules, you just keep going along and you're on that expedited path. But if not, we'll sort of divert you off, and then we'll look at that in that part. So that's the licensing assembly line. We redesigned the application, but then the core really is this, what we call presumed acceptable approach. So rather than having to take a bespoke review of every single part of your application and kind of re-ask ourselves the question, is this in the public interest? The commission's proposing to say, okay, all of this over here is in the public interest. If you want to do that, let's get you through as quickly as possible. Otherwise, we'll take a look. And one of the things you really got to deal with when you're dealing with innovation is the rules often will lag what innovators want to do, right? So we got to have a space for someone to say, hey, I want to do something outside the rules, and then we'll review that. And so we make that space. But that's the basic gist of the licensing assembly line and how we really hope to make the process more flexible, more predictable, and faster.
Yeah, no, and I think it's a really interesting model, and not to steal away anything from the Space Bureau, but in many ways, it really is a reminder of what the FCC did several years on infrastructure, right? Where it's a very similar approach, and I think that other government agencies could really learn from it, which is like, how do I identify the 90 or 95% of things that should not take time? Right? And that's going to provide speed and really be helpful to industry and other stakeholders. And then you can focus on that 5% that are more challenging. Yeah,
we have to recognize there are a reason that regulators exist, right? There are some times when the regulator needs to regulate. But if that wasn't the case, then you just shouldn't have the regulator at all. But you're absolutely right. What we were finding is in this very large volume that now comes through Space Bureau, lots of people are asking for things that shouldn't be controversial.
So, it's a really helpful way of looking at things and doing this. And if you adopt it largely as proposed, I think there will be, quite a bit of acclaim from industry. But at the same time, I'm sure you're not looking to rest on your laurels. How are you going to measure success, and how will you think about making adjustments if there are things that aren't working, things that could do better? Like, how is the FCC going to stay nimble in order to make sure that this actually accomplishes the goals that we all want?
Yeah, great question. And we already are trying to track our metrics much better. And we've even, we showed the chairman some of these, and he said, hey, I want to present those at the I think it was the August meeting, And so it's very important, I think, to have that accountability. And even right now, been working with the team prior to the commission changing any rules on this to say, how can we have better operational excellence? So yeah, look, I think metrics are key. One of the things that we also do in the modernization is we do set some, if you want to call them shot clocks, right? So for instance, a common criticism we heard was that the FCC can be a black box, and you put in your application and you don't hear back, and you don't know where it is, and everybody knows that there's other people wanting things, but you just don't know where it is. And I think we certainly owe applicants more than that. And so we've proposed in the modernization item, we've proposed that there'd sort of be a few, we wanted to make it simple, but there'd be a few key points where you would have an expectation of knowing where it is. And so the two basic ones are within a month, 30 days, you would either hear back from us saying, this part of your application isn't yet complete, so you need to provide some more information. That's very common, that someone might forget a portion, or we'll put it on public notice as required by statute. So you get that within 30 days. It goes on public notice, and then after that, we have all the comments in. There's 60 days in which either best case, and I feel pretty confident that we would be able to grant and act on most applications within that 60-day period, but we also recognize there could be situations where there's other things going on. So we at least are going to owe you that, required by our rules, we would get back to you and we'd say, here are the outstanding issues with your application. So those are sort of accountability pieces that we did want to put into the rules to where people have that predictability, which I don't think has frankly existed in the past.
Yeah, and the point about a black box is a really good one. It's great to see this on the non-federal side. Of course, Adam is not here for us to pick on him, but I think another area that you all will be focusing on that's really important is you also don't want a black box if there's some federal equity, right? Because in a lot of these bands, there are federal operations, right? And so how do we ensure, of course, there are situations where things are classified and there are good reasons people don't know, but how do we have more visibility, more transparency so that applicants can know when they're applying, hey, this is something that I'm ready to launch very soon, and this is likely to get approved, right, and have that transparency. So obviously, faster, streamlined licensing is really important, and we've talked about that, but new spectrum is also critical, right? Particularly as we're going to see the growth of these constellations, as we're going to see the U.S. have to compete. So you have the spectrum abundance proceeding, proposes to make an absolutely massive amount of spectrum available for LEO. I'm curious how you think about how do you meet demand in that proceeding? How do you think about the equities of terrestrial and satellite and making sure that you meet this massive demand for satellite while also ensuring that terrestrial providers have what they need? And what are the opportunities? How do you think about, without getting into specific bands, sort of win-win proposals, like the ability to have more different industries in terms of satellite and terrestrial really be able to use spectrum?
Sure. So thanks for plugging the spectrum abundance for satellite connectivity. NPRM, I think it was over 20,000 megahertz of spectrum proposed across 4 different bands, so 42, 52, upper 12, and the W band, which is like above 95. And so our hope is that in 2026 we could start to go to order on some of those. We're obviously reviewing the record, and I think one of the things that we've certainly seen is that opportunities for sharing and protecting, mentioned terrestrial and sort of coexistence and so forth, things that were not necessarily possible a decade ago, for instance, now can be possible. In October, we had this modernization item. Alongside that, we also had another item on spectrum, which really is about spectrum sharing and figuring out the terrestrial and satellite sharing in these infospans. I think you probably worked on that in the past, And so it's one of those things that as technologies evolve and as the market evolves, you might be able to do new things through technology to where kind of no one has to actually give up anything, but that may not have been possible in the past. So we're certainly looking at all of those sorts of opportunities, and I think we'll be able to make some good headway.
Yeah, no, that's great to hear. I mean, this is a situation where I think there's a recognition, but we spent several years, and at the time, I think it was the right call transitioning spectrum from satellite to terrestrial at a time when the mobile industry was growing, and the mobile industry is going to continue to grow, right? But I think there's a recognition that you have growth on both sides, and like, how do we fully accommodate that in a nimble way that ensures that we're meeting demand for everyone? So in terms of space, right, you have LEO, you have GEO, you have MEO, you have these traditional categories, right, of orbits. But you also have novel space activities. There was an August EO from the Trump administration on this that was really looking at the need. You have in-orbit refueling, orbital debris removal. You have these really important activities for space. So I'm wondering about the FCC's role in that, both vis-a-vis spectrum and working with other parts of the federal government to make sure that you're not a hindrance to those sorts of novel activities.
Yeah, this is a really exciting area. Something that I've said a few times recently is that I think we're living through the space industrial revolution. And I say that in part because I liken, if you look at the plot from 1000 AD through today of GDP per capita in like the Europe, right? What you see is a flat line until about 1800, and then it goes straight up. Right? That's the Industrial Revolution occurring. If you look at plots, for instance, of the number of objects launched into space, right, from 1957, Sputnik, right, 1957 to today, right around 2016, 2018, it starts to go vertical as well. So that's why I call it the Space Industrial Revolution. But something, when you have these sort of broad categories of new industries or industrial revolutions, is you kind of have the core thing. So think of like auto industry. You have the core thing, and then you have all of these follow-on things that happen. So you got like parts suppliers that, supply chain that needs to develop. And then you have mechanics that, need to be there to service the cars, right? And then people build car washes and like all of these sort of things that build around it. And so this novel space or non-traditional category, I think, is really evidence that we are in that, that space industrial revolution, and things are maturing from, as you said, just the traditional GEOs, and then now we have, these large NGSO constellations and smaller NGSO constellations, and now we're starting to get into that servicing and supply, and people thinking about, hey, are there new ways to sort of build that infrastructure and maybe set refueling out there in space, to leapfrog and so forth. I think that's a really exciting and interesting part that's just developing, and there's a lot going on. Very, very happy to see the president signing the executive order, talking about the mission authorization framework for the novel space activities, trying to figure out ways that we can really accelerate that and hopefully streamline the process. But yeah, this is something that the FCC is also has had to been dealing with for a few years, because we often were having this kind of square peg round hole issue where our rules were written for GSOs and more traditional NGSOs, but then folks would want to come in with mission extension vehicles or lunar and so forth, the guys that go and like catch the orbital debris, and people want to do all these sorts of really interesting things, right? And so when we started to talk about modernization, and I think modernization means a bunch of different things. One of the things is recognizing, hey, we actually have a new class here, and the way we've chosen to organize it in our proposal is thinking in terms of kind of the physical space that you're in, so GSO, so traditional NGSO, and then we create a new category which we call VTSS, so Variable Trajectory Spacecraft System. The idea being that these might go on missions, and they might be a 15-year mission, but it might be going up to move one GSO or extend the life of the GSO, and then it goes somewhere else, right? So that's where you get the variable trajectory. And so we now are proposing to think of sort of those three possibilities: GSO, NGSO, VTSS, and then sort of down the other axis. I'm drawing an axis here if you can't tell. Yeah, down the other axis, that's where you then deal with your spectrum, right? So some of them, the different missions will have different spectrum needs. So we sort of separated those two. And really the key is to say, hey, this is a new class, and it's going to be a developing class. And so we want to have enough flexibility in there, but we're now proposing this new VTSS category for exactly that reason. And maybe that will dovetail with some of the mission authorization work that's going on as a result of the EO. We talk about that in the NPRM. And then I think the last thing I'd say is we recognize that these sort of missions, just the types of rules and expectations that you would want to have, so think around space safety issues, are just going to be different, right? So another thing that we were constantly running into, and this is kind of that situation where the innovation front runs the ruls, right? Because we do have to follow the APA and everything like that, right? And so
those pesky lawyers,
right? So we we're always having these situations where it almost became a little comical, where you're trying to apply rules on space safety, for instance, to that were designed for a typical trajectory type system to these what we're now calling variable trajectory systems. And so we said, hey, you actually probably need some different expectations. So we still want to have the expectation of space safety, but it's going to look different. So for instance, with the VTSS, we're proposing that you would have a requirement to provide your ephemeris, right, to the space situational awareness systems. And so again, there's another example of like the type of infrastructure that we want to build up. And there's others in government working on SSAs as well. And this is kind of our little part to say, we think that's a reasonable expectation.
Yeah, no, that's great to hear. I mean, I think, this is about LEO, but ultimately those novel space activities are going to be critical to leadership in LEO, right?
Which is some will be in LEO, right?
Yeah, and some will be in LEO, right? Which is to say that, LEO satellites, their life cycle is getting longer and longer, but they're not up as long as GEO. So if you can do that in-orbit refueling, then you can really make them more economical. And there are a lot of opportunities there, as well as debris removal. So I talked a bit about the EU Space Act. Right now, it's a proposal. It's a situation, first of all, I do want to say something good about it, which is that as opposed to having dozens of European countries that are individually licensing these things, which must be an absolute nightmare for industry, you do have an EU-wide approach. But at the same time, there are a lot of concerns about this in terms of having a fair, harmonized approach, particularly going back to what we were talking about, where you want U.S. allies and partners, you want democracies, open societies, to create large markets for LEO, where all of their companies can compete, and then ultimately create a space architecture that really reflects their values. So I'm curious if the FCC has any perspective on the proposal as it currently stands.
Yeah, I mean, so alongside the rest of the U.S. government, we are very much involved in speaking with Europeans about their proposal. I think the worry is that there is at least a certain amount of anti-competitive or protectionist anti-competitiveness involved in this proposal, and I think that would be bad for all of us. And this is a really important opportunity for Europe and the United States to work together. And I think that the groundwork, even within the in their proposal is laid there for instance, recognition of equivalence between for the United States, and I would hope that we can get to that place. And then look, I think there's other. I just mentioned space situational awareness systems. I think there's probably some good areas which the proposal talks about there, where there could be opportunities to coordinate again. And so our hope is that, as you said, that this is just a proposal that they have, and that now is the time for some really healthy dialogue and recognition that we can work together.
Yeah, I mean, I like your way of framing things. I have a lot of concerns about it as it's currently written. The focus tends to be on the way it would just ensnare U.S. operators, essentially, and be anti-competitive. But, I mean, there are just some fundamental things there. You have USPA, you have the same government entity that would both be regulating foreign operators and provisioning the European LEO champion IRIS, right? Which, I mean, can you imagine if the FCC was both regulating some companies and then standing up a U.S. champion? So, but I like the way you frame things, because this is also an opportunity, right? We want harmonized space regulations. We want to take the best ideas they have and vice versa, right? So hopefully this is an area where we can really reach an agreement and then leverage that on a global basis.
Yeah, look, I've spent the last half hour telling you about all of our ways we want to streamline things, and so I think it would be a really bad outcome and something that we'd have to respond to if we effectively didn't matter because Europe put an incredibly onerous regime in place. So I think they can decide how they want to regulate in their country, but they should not stretch that to where it ultimately is a protectionist scheme that's harming U.S. companies.
So before we finish up, Work 27, we don't have time to get into specific proposals or anything like that. One of the things for those folks in the audience who don't understand Jay's job, it's actually like two massive, almost impossible jobs, which is, one is that he's regulating all commercial space in the United States, and the other is that he's the space ambassador to the world on many of these issues. And those are they're related, right? They're issues that overlap, but either one of those could be a very high-level demanding job. So I think as we're approaching Work 27 in the preparatory process, it'd be helpful to understand how the Chairman Carr and you are thinking about that, what you're going to be doing, in terms of working with NTI and State Department, and just sort of the stakes as you see it.
Sure, lots of good possible ways I could answer that. We are collaborating very closely, first of all, with NTIA and others in U.S. government to develop positions. And I think that there is a lot of recognition of how important it is that the U.S. Come together with strong positions. That's sort of step one in succeeding at Work 27. Look, I think I'll answer it this way. We are very interested in finding sort of coalitions of other countries that are have an innovation first mindset. So, we didn't talk about our a proposal the Commission adopted to look at the EPFD limits and so forth. But that's an example of where there are some, fairly outdated limits there. It's an incredibly technical discussion on exactly how we should protect GEOs and maybe allow NGSOs to operate at higher power limits and deliver better service. But that's an example of where we've had a number of other countries even come to us and say, hey, we're interested in what you're doing there, because they recognize the value to their citizens of getting better satellite service as well. And so, but I think there's also a very innovation first mindset. And we're trying to have that at the FCC. And so I think about it as, yeah, we got to have our positions, locked down for the U.S. and be on the ball there. But then really trying to find coalitions of other countries, not even specifically on that issue, but all of these various issues where we recognize that our interests are aligned, and that may even be different on different issues. But I think I think the chairman and I and others really want to be looking around for other countries that are willing to be coalition partners as we go into Work 27.
Yeah, I love that approach, that innovation first mindset. I think it could really draw a lot of countries in because, there are a lot of other nations that are also looking for opportunities in space, which is great and understandable. This is a whole huge ecosystem that's growing, right? So there are all kinds of opportunities, whether that's in telecom, LEO satellites or other types of satellites, right? And so the more countries we can get to embrace that mindset, they'll see the opportunities, and it also creates the ability to generate consensus at the work. So that's super, super helpful.
And yeah, I mean, when we go overseas and have a lot of bilaterals, you get a lot of good conversations, and you see how folks are often asking us, seeing us as regulatory leaders in many ways, asking what framework are you using for NGSO sharing or for direct to device, for instance. So we get a lot of these questions. And I think there's a great opportunity for the U.S. to share. Sort of, we've gone through a lot of the hard regulatory work to figure out what regulatory framework works, and then share that with the rest of the world.
Great. Well, I want to thank Jay for what was an incredibly substantive, illuminating discussion, and just for all the work you all are doing. You're clearly, at breakneck speed in terms of trying to enable things in the U.S. So really appreciate it, and I know that industry and other stakeholders do as well. So with that, I'm going to introduce our second panel. So it's going to be moderated by Lauren Williams, who's our Deputy Director in the Strategic Technologies Program. And the panelists are going to be Paula Trimble, who's Vice President of Government Affairs at Moonspace, Audrey Allison, who's a Senior Policy Analyst at Aerospace Corporation, and Clayton Swoop, who's here at CSIS. He's Deputy Director of the Aerospace Security Project. So that's really going to look more at the national security side of things. So thank you.
All right, I think we are all set. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lauren Williams, and as Matt noted, I am the Deputy Director and Senior Fellow for the Strategic Technologies Program here at CSIS. Thanks for joining us again for a great set of discussions on the kind of entirety of the LEO satellite ecosystem. And obviously so far with FCC Space Bureau Chief Jay Schwartz, we talked a lot about developments in federal satellite regulation and licensing and new developments there. We're going to take a pivot, but a needed pivot, in this panel to talk about, kind of build on that and dig into national security considerations in low Earth orbit. And obviously that's in context of the incredible growth and scale of satellite constellations and the growth of industry and the increased leveraging of commercial space in national security missions. So to set this scene, and then I'll introduce our fantastic panelists here. Over the past decades, LEO satellites have evolved from what some might have said were niche assets to critical infrastructure. They shape both civilian life and military operations. And of course, they, as we talked about in the previous discussion, they provide connectivity, enable real-time communications on the battlefield, as well as increasingly serve as force multipliers also on the battlefield. Commercial satellite constellations, which were once kind of considered additive to government operations are now, as we all know, essential for military and civilian uses. And the war in Ukraine, of course, only served to underscore that reality, as government and commercial satellites were increasingly on the front lines of conflict. But in this conversation today, we want to continue the conversation around geostrategic competition with China, of course, which has long been focused on space and is looking to catch up to the United States in low Earth orbit and is making big investments. And most recently, just this week, we saw that the Chinese National Space Administration is prioritizing expansion and investment in commercial space. And then previously, the 15th five-year plan included aerospace as a strategic priority in the PRC. So these are important developments to keep in mind. And of course, while space systems are becoming ever more ubiquitous, they're also facing growing threats, which we're going to talk about today, from kinetic, anti-satellite weapons and electronic warfare to cyber operations. And this is all amid that intensifying geopolitical conflict. And then, of course, at the same time, policy and regulatory challenges changes are growing, and there are developments, including around spectrum policy, as we just discussed. And policy and regulatory developments are just being challenged to keep pace with the growth of the commercial space industry. So all of that to say that the stakes for securing LEO infrastructure, while also not stifling innovation, are growing. So with that intro, again, we have Paula Trumbull here, who is Vice President for Government Affairs and Strategy at Muon Space and previously served in the Space Development Agency within the Pentagon. We have Audrey Allison, who's Senior Project Leader at the Center for Space Policy and Strategy in the Aerospace Corporation. And last but not least, we have Clayton Swope, who's the Deputy Director and Senior Fellow in CSIS's Aerospace Security Project, to share their diverse experiences and dive into this discussion with some questions. So I will first turn to Clayton, and would really appreciate you kind of setting the scene and starting from that Ukraine context. Share with the audience how we've seen conversations related to national security, use of space, kind of from a commercial and government context change, and then also how should we think about U.S. leadership in LEO in the context of kind of growing prioritization and investment of space from China?
Yeah, well, I may just take it a bit further back from Ukraine. In my mind, I think it's good to just set a baseline understanding that you could say, humankind's conquest of space, it's always had a military element. It hasn't always been non-military. The first man-made object in space was a V-2 rocket in June 1944. So we look past that, and we kind of see that, we might say dual use today, but the military and the non-military uses have always existed side by side. Looking at commercial, I think it's interesting to note, too, that when we think about commercial services from space, that has a long pedigree as well. The first communication satellite in geostationary orbit was Intelsat 1. That was 1965. The first license for a commercial remote sensing company, that was 1992. So things have been trending in a direction both of this long-time trend, military and non-military uses of space, important to national security, important to economic security, science, exploration, also important to business and the commercial use of space. I think what we saw with Ukraine was an overlap of three trends that didn't happen in 2022, but just had been building. One is costs of getting access to a service in space from a commercial capability, that was going down. Performance was improving. Accessibility was increasing. It was easier to get access and use a service in space. That was everything from remote sensing and specifically broadband. So we all know Starlink, OneWeb is also available, Amazon Leo soon enough. But all three of those things overlapped in a way that we saw the battlefield advantage from space, specifically from commercial space services like we'd never really seen before. Even though, again, long history, commercial SATCOM was used extensively in the Gulf War even, but again, those three factors that really made it work and a critical mass in Ukraine, I think opened a lot of people's eyes to that military utility from a tactical standpoint in particular. I think the other thing that we want to keep in mind, and I'm kind of thinking of your question, Lauren, about competition with China, is the economic benefit of space to the United States, to jobs, to growth, the business case for space. It's been there a long time, but it really has taken off when you see all those three things come together, that cost, the technology and performance, and then the accessibility. So it's those two things that really, in my mind, speak to why the U.S. wants to really keep an edge, keep a lead. It's that national security battlefield impact, specifically that tactical impact we saw in Ukraine. And then also, though, that business case, the economics of space, because that's leading directly to jobs in the United States and leading to better service when it comes to broadband for people in a way that we just haven't seen before. And that would have happened without Ukraine. I think that economic piece, but it's definitely that military piece that we really saw front and center.
That's really helpful, and appreciate the broader, longer historical context here. So one of the policy questions that certainly was heightened and getting a lot of attention around during and in the months after the beginning of the start of the war in Ukraine is, how the U.S. government is, or we'll say the Pentagon specifically, is thinking today about protecting companies that are increasingly, or companies operating LEO satellite constellations that are increasingly on the front lines of conflict. I know this is something that you've written about, Clayton. So one, how is the government thinking about these things from several years ago to where we are today? And then kind of a second piece of that is, what risks are private companies now taking on in this context, or what risks should we be thinking about companies taking on as satellites or commercial satellites are increasingly involved in conflict?
Yeah, just two brief points here. I think from a cyber domain standpoint, cyber attacks, everyone's on the front line. It doesn't matter if you're operating in space or you're a data center or a power plant or some other infrastructure. It doesn't matter physically where you are, you're on the front line there. So really space is no different in that regard. When it comes to the physical realm, I do think space looks a lot different than, say, a data center in Ashburn or a power plant in California. The difference being that space is outside of national jurisdiction. It's outside of national territory. It looks maybe akin to the high seas or maybe international airspace. So we do have to think what threats will manifest itself in that special way in space. It doesn't matter if you're commercial or government-owned and operated system. And then what do we do to maybe safeguard those systems to make sure that we're minimizing the threats as much as possible? This is a really thorny question because I do think it comes down to a financial risk calculation for the company that's operating the systems that the government might want to think about helping to mitigate. I think we don't quite know what that front line looks like when we're thinking about a kinetic physical threat because we really haven't seen a bunch of satellites getting shot down during a conflict. Would that happen in a war? Probably would. How does the government think about a way to minimize that financial risk to a company while at the same time still making the dollars and cents work for buying a commercial service? I really think that's an open question, but I do think there are other models and other domains that make a lot of sense that the government's looking at. It might be insurance, it might be some type of indemnification, it might be some way to say, hey, if this happens, we have your back financially, and this is how we're going to treat a commercial system if there is a kinetic threat or a threat of a kinetic threat, which actually arguably we've already seen from Russia, but at least know kind of how the government would respond to that. So there's that financial piece of it that the government's thinking about, but then also how does it actually respond? What is the response if there is more of that kinetic physical type of attack against a system in space?
That's helpful, and you obviously, first touched on a point that I care a lot about, which is the kind of growing awareness and appreciation of the cyber threat to space systems, and it brings up conversations, including to your point, around how there's increasingly an appreciation for kind of the critical infrastructure elements of commercial, or rather just of satellites in general, and how much they enable and bolster kind of terrestrial and space-based communications. So that certainly does imply that, and we've seen this increasingly over time, that satellite operators need to be kind of taking the same approaches to securing their systems from cyber threats as we've traditionally seen terrestrial critical infrastructure operators take. So I appreciate that point. So let's pivot to you, Paula, and drawing on your experience, and be first in your experience in the Pentagon from that hat. And maybe building on Clayton's response to how the Pentagon is thinking about these issues today. And by these issues, I mean kind of increasing leveraging and integration of commercial space capabilities, and then also kind of drawing on some of these commercial approaches, such as proliferated architectures. So let's go there first. Kind of how is the Pentagon thinking about these issues today? And of course, you know that I want to ask about your perspective on threats as well.
Sure, thanks. Obviously, I'm now a few months out of the Pentagon, but I think we can all pretty clearly see that the threats are articulated and that China is the leading one, right? In the last few months, even more satellites being launched, reusable launch vehicles on the pad. And so, I don't think that there's a shift in thinking about who the threat is. I think the biggest threat that the Pentagon is worried about is not being able to move fast enough to get ahead of the threat, right? It's sort of self-imposed. We've got problems with acquisition systems, requirements processes, the ability to incorporate cybersecurity requirements and needs that require certification and standards. And so I think, some of it is self-imposed, some of it is intentional, and obviously there's the biggest threat, which is the one we experience every year now, which is continuing resolutions and unreliable budgets, which don't just impact the Pentagon's ability to meet the threat, right? They impact industry. And I'm at a small company now, right? The predictability of federal budgets, the predictability of contracts, and their continuation is the key part of the partnership that enables us to deliver capabilities when they're needed and where they're needed. So I think, there are lots of kinetic threats and cyber threats and common threats to spacecraft systems that have sort of led us to this point of building more resilient systems in multiple orbits, smaller satellites with emerging capabilities integrated and replenishing them on a regular basis. But all of these things that are being underlined by the threat is happening today, and we don't really have time to waste.
Absolutely, that's super helpful. And maybe to kind of dig in to your point there, just about how much modern LEO constellations, and this is both in government and obviously on the commercial side of things, really rely on proliferated architectures to enhance their resilience to the threats that we've just talked about. So if you can kind of put a finer point for us, Paula, on how proliferation in particular, and you also talked about use of multiple orbits, how does that kind of specifically manifest in more resilience? And so why are we seeing both government and in commercial operators increasingly rely on these approaches?
Yeah, I think, what we're seeing is something that is enabled by the decreasing and continually decreasing cost of launch, right? Proliferating lots of satellites in low Earth orbit wasn't really a possibility just over a decade ago or 2 decades ago. It is enabled by the fact that the cost of launch is not the biggest piece of the puzzle for us anymore, and we can now proliferate hundreds of satellites like the proliferated warfighting space architecture that SDA is developing, to meet mission needs, right? And I think that's the thing we all are focused on, is that industry and government are coming together to produce architectures that meet a mission, and they meet it in a different way that is less vulnerable to attack, is, unlike single satellites in geostationary orbit, or that allow us to lower the cost enough that we can bring on new capabilities, invite new entrants on a regular basis. And so I think that proliferation piece is sort of part of the puzzle. It also goes along with, predictable timelines, delivery timelines being shorter, enabling capabilities from the commercial sector like Earth observation, alternative positioning, navigation, and timing, and of course the one that everyone's super familiar with, which is satellite communications, which is largely being provided to the Defense Department, the Space Force, by commercial providers today. And so we're at a sort of transition pivot point now where I think these architectures are being relied on as a core capability, and not only that, commercial industry can be relied on as part of that core capability because they're launching for other customers as well. And so we're really at this point where there's a transformation happening in the Pentagon that matches what's happening in industry, and I think it behooves the Pentagon to keep up, right, and be able to keep incorporating the new technologies as they come online. The commercial space strategy, I don't want to fail to mention, the Space Force and the department have put out commercial space integration strategies, and specifically looking at missions where there are commercial capabilities that are already available in the market and that don't just serve the department. Those are kind of the 2 key areas where we're seeing that start to change.
No, I think I'm glad you mentioned the two most recent kind of commercial space strategies that have come out of the Pentagon, because I think even over the last, several years, even as Clayton talked about earlier, how commercial satellites have been utilized for government missions for some time. It has taken some time for the Pentagon to articulate a coherent strategy around how it is thinking about leveraging and integrating commercial space capabilities even just in the last year. So kind of an example of the lag times and that it takes in some cases for government to kind of articulate how it's keeping up with modern commercial trends. So let's turn to you now, Audrey. And based on the kind of threat conversation and the trends that we've talked about in terms of government approaches and commercial approaches, policy and regulatory approaches, how do you think about those, and what should the United States be pursuing? And including policy related to spectrum to help us maintain our geostrategic advantage with competitors like China, while also not stifling commercial space integration, or rather innovation.
Well, thank you for including me in this discussion. I'm a visitor from the kind of an odd corner of the space policy world, and that's spectrum, which military, science, communications, everybody needs spectrum in order to operate from space, to control their spacecraft, to be able to deliver on their mission. And in the case of space, and in the particular case of LEO communication satellites, that spectrum it doesn't care if you're a national security mission or you're a communication satellite. You've got to have reliable access to space everywhere in your orbit where you will operate. And in order for it to work, you need really strong, not only domestic regulations, but you need a harmonized global regulatory environment for this assured performance of these space missions. And so everybody has the same stake. Both kinds of national security or commercial, but also doesn't matter if you're European or Chinese or a Canadian system. So we all have to work together, and we have a UN body called the International Telecommunication Union, where we come together and work on this harmonized regulatory framework that has been largely, it's sausage making, quite frankly, but it's amazing how well it has functioned for us. The United States has been very engaged in this process since 1947. They had a series of conferences in New York to form the UN, and they brought in the ITU, which previously existed for telegraphs and other systems. They brought it into the UN system, and the U.S. was, this happened in Atlantic City, New Jersey, actually. And the U.S. was firmly behind it. And the United States, from all the various walks of life that need spectrum, have been a real fundamental player in this consistently throughout this long history. And that includes representatives directly from national security. So they've helped frame the regulations that have made the industry's success possible. Of course, they needed to do the innovation, but you needed a regulatory framework to make these services we have today possible. And that was largely adopted like 20 years ago, and it didn't develop till now. So this spectrum can mostly be shared among multiple operators from multiple countries, and it just needs to be coordinated, and everyone has to follow the regulations. And then there's this healthy process of continuously updating these international regulations, which happens every 4 years at the World Radio Conference. So we have this system, and the U.S. is a very seasoned participant, and there are interagency processes. And the other key element is that it is highly inclusive of industry as a participant in this this iterative process of updating to bring in new technologies, new industries, new services, but also new national needs, and bringing them in and as a global matter every 4 years, accommodating them in this framework. Well, how would a military system be able to do this? Well, we have been so successful because our interests in our commercial systems usually cover our interests for spectrum needs and protections for our military services as well. So we have people from all government interests sitting with industry, but it's the government at conferences, at treaty conferences, that is the decision maker, but we're all there together, and we've been able to manage our interests in national security very well through this kumbaya process I'm making it sound like. It's really sausage making. But China is a member of this, and Russia and previously USSR, and to some degree they have similar interests as us. They have satellite systems. Russia has long had interests in maintaining its satellite systems. Throughout the Cold War, the US and USSR had kind of parallel interests in common. So we were able to keep this process working. So it's interesting now to see China with their newfound interest in LEO systems and how that is going to change their positions. Right now, they're still in lockstep with Russia on many issues. But as we come up to the next World Radio Conference, which they are hosting and chairing, it's going to be a very different experience, I think.
Absolutely. No, that's really helpful. And I was, as you just did, going to bring up the context or the example of the World Radio Conference coming up and being hosted in Shanghai. And kind of the role that the United States might play in shaping, international norms, given, the United States perspectives on, currently on engaging in international fora, as well as the fact that this conference is being held in Shanghai. But I think you touched on the important role that we have played historically. Is there anything that you would add in terms of how you see the United States engaging in Work 27 coming up soon?
Well, it's imperative that the U.S. is fully engaged in order to continue to lead in this area and, of course, to advance its interests both in a national security standpoint, and we have so many strong commercial interests as well. So the United States is, well, first of all, let me say that ITU just confirmed. Yes, yesterday they put out a press release confirming that Shanghai is indeed going to be the venue for the conference. So that is now set for October of 2027. And before this decision was taken, China actually hosted the preparatory meetings on the satellite issues. And they did a fantastic job demonstrating their capability of hosting the conference. So hosting a conference, China emphasized that they would be leaning forward to help lesser developed countries be able to participate in the conference, to attend at reduced rates of accommodation and travel. So we think this will be the largest conference. Every WRC is larger than the previous one, and we expect there'll be 4,000 delegates there. But it's going to happen, and we'll have to make it a success. And we have a couple of years to figure out how we'll do that.
Absolutely. So it emphasizes the role that the United States plays, especially in this context, is going to be incredibly critical for shaping kind of future outcomes going forward. Okay, so to kind of close out this discussion, and we've talked a lot about both threats as well as trends when it comes to kind of national security considerations in space. specifically related to Leo constellations. So I'll give the opportunity for a final lightning round, because I know we've touched on this quite a bit during this conversation, to ask each of you, and maybe I'll start with Paula, kind of which threat or dynamic, and by dynamic it could I mean even just kind of maybe China's growth and emphasis on space could be one example. What threat or dynamic most keeps you up at night, and if you have a recommendation for policymakers, what might that be?
Yeah, I don't think my biggest fear has changed much in the last few years. My biggest fear is ensuring that we have the workforce available here in the United States to be able to scale appropriately and manufacture what we need to manufacture and get it into space. So I have been concerned for several years that we aren't adequately developing a workforce that is sensitive to global issues and that also has all of the technical capabilities we need, particularly for components and subcomponents to be built at scale. And so I think, anything we can do to kind of focus on the US supply chain for space would be very well spent by policymakers, really looking at where we can incentivize people to move into this field and also to share the risk.
Over to you, Audrey.
Yes. So as we're continuously preparing for the next World Radio Conference, and the U.S. has a lot of leadership. People watch what the U.S. is doing. We have the leading systems, and we have the opportunity to continue to lead even as we go to Shanghai for the conference. We've got a great story to tell, and I'm confident we'll continue to do that. But we need to reach out with our regular allies. We have a very strong regional preparatory process through the Americas region, which we need to continuously lead, working through that group. We've pulled it out before, and we'll continue to do so because we've managed to, really find a way to build strong coalitions and bring more services to the world.
Absolutely. So the shape that the interagency process takes in the United States is going to be very important. All right, Clayton, the final word.
Okay, maybe it's not a recommendation, but just, excuse me, more of something that I'm watching as someone that works at a think tank and gets to opine and have opinions but not implement anything.
Yeah.
Somehow I get paid for that. I don't know how. I think the competition angle with China, the one thing that I don't really know how it's going to pan out, and I am watching, when I look back to the playbook China used for telecommunications writ large, I look at ZTE and Huawei and how those companies got a global reach, and before we knew it, we turned around and the infrastructure, they got their hooks in everything. And I think it was by offering it at a low cost and willing to give subsidies, and then a lot of people signed on board, including the United States, Western Europe, a lot of countries where now they say, I would never do that. I don't want to use that infrastructure. We are getting rid of it. Now, fast forward to space, will we see a similar thing happen with space where people trust offerings from China? I have a big question mark there. So when it comes to space launch, we don't really see it right now. But we see a lot of uptick in Europe and the United States for buying broadband from a Chinese company. I don't know if I see it. So what does that leave from a business standpoint, from a business competition for Chinese companies offering some of these space services? Does that mean they get to sell to the global south? Well, that's great, but you're probably going to have to subsidize that to make it work. So from a business standpoint, from a making money standpoint, I don't know where that leaves some of these Chinese companies. So just to kind of cap this off, I think there is a competition. I just don't, from a business standpoint, I just don't know if companies from China offering space services, I don't know if they're going to be able to follow the same progression that we saw with telecommunications, because there's just so much distrust from I think the West right now for what's something that would be offered from China. I don't know who's going to buy it. So I don't know how successful those enterprises are going to be unless they are totally dependent on the PRC to pay and buy stuff, and that's what keeps those businesses alive. Good question. I don't have an answer for it.
A good question, and maybe an optimistic response or a note for us to end on for this conversation. So thank you all so much, of course, for joining us for this discussion, and to our panelists. And we will now have a short break, but I will note before the short break that we will come back with a third panel on spectrum policy and international issues. So to dive deeper into some of the conversation we've already had today, and that will be moderated by Matt Pearl, with panelists Karina Perez, Joe Kane, Mike Calabrese, and Jay Armand Musi. Thank you all.
I don't know. Is that where the moderator? I don't even know. Is that where the moderator-
We are going to start fighting.
So,
He said, I thought it was moderator.
policy issues I was thinking face not always logical. Kind of like you're told you can't bring drinks in the room. Amen. We have drinks right here. I was going to try to work that in.
There you go.
Yeah, I don't think Bob would bother this carpet. This is exactly the right. It's exactly the right carpet for bringing drinks.
Sorry, man.
All right, so we'll go ahead and get back started. So this is our third panel, which is on spectrum policy and international issues. Obviously, have discussed those to some extent, but we've got several experts that can really delve a bit deeper. So we're joined by Joe Kane, who's your director at ITIF, right? Director at ITIF, who covers telecom, space, a whole lot of other issues at one of the other major DC think tanks. We also have Michael Calabrese from New America, who has covered telecom and space for them for many, many years, and has a lot of expertise on those issues as well. We have Karina Perez, who's the director of the Space Policy Center at CCIA, one of the major tech trade associations, and who does a lot of work on satellite, particularly low Earth orbit satellite. And then we have Armand Mousset, who is a fixture in telecom and space. He is the CEO and founder of Summit Ridge Group, which does financial valuation and other advisory services related to space, among other things. So we have a lot of expertise on this panel, so I'll just jump right in. So I talked a bit with Jay about this proposal to move from Part 25 to Part 100. I'm curious on your thoughts on the degree to which some of the challenges that we've seen in terms of licensing of satellite systems, is this going to solve them? To what extent do you think this is going to accelerate the process? And are there any other regulatory or even legislative changes that we may have to look at? Obviously, this is a great start, but that may improve things even more in order to maintain U.S. leadership. So that's for anybody.
Yeah, I think it's a good start. I think speed is really important here. Having people sit around waiting in line at the FCC doesn't help anyone on any level. So I think it will solve a lot of problems there. It doesn't solve all the problems. It doesn't solve all your spectrum problems. You're still going to need more spectrum access. But it does mean when you have, for example, bonds that keep from being too many applicants who are not serious applicants, that's fewer people you have to coordinate with, and therefore you can end up with more productive spectrum arrangements through the coordination process. So I expect a lot of benefits there.
Yeah, I think another item too is, as we're seeing the demand for launch and trying to meet those deadlines, the proposal of updating the timelines to match the ITU deployment timelines are actually really helpful as we're trying to catch up to all the satellites that are trying to be put into orbit. So that's one of the good things. And like you said, Joe, it's a great starting point. And I'm actually very excited to see what some of the smaller companies have to say and how that might impact them, because I know that specifically when they're new entrants coming in, trying to figure out how to navigate the FCC, this will definitely, I think, help with innovation. And some of the long-standing players will also, I think, be appreciative of knowing where their application is, knowing if they miss something accidentally, or and not just kind of sitting there and thinking, hey, can you tell me what I need to do next, or if I'm even moving forward. So I think it's a great start, and so looking forward to actually getting to comment on this.
Any thoughts? Armand can be a bull in a china. So, is there any need for more fundamental reforms, or sort of how do you see this in terms of improving things versus other ways that we need to look at that perhaps are a bit more radical and it could require Congress, right?
Well, I think, first of all, I'll listen to Jay's talk, and I don't want to take anything away from it. I think that the idea of making the FCC more efficient and
trying to open up this process for more applicants. All that makes a ton of sense, but also have to look at this, I think, realistically, and that is with respect, I think, to the mega constellations that everyone's talking about. I think we're pretty much done, right? We have SpaceX and we have Amazon Kuiper, and in the West, that's probably actually changed the name. Sorry, Amazon Leo. Just changed the name, right? It's unlikely that we'll have many more of that size. That's sort of done, right? So it's not like the floodgates are opening. The FCC will have to deal with. I think the advantages that are going to come from some of the processes that are being changed at the FCC are going to be to some of the small niche players, people maybe trying to do in-orbit servicing or trying to do relay services to the moon, very little niche sort of things. So I think it's not as potentially revolutionary as maybe people would like to think. I don't think we're on this huge new move to have multiple additional mega constellations.
Yeah, I was adding that, I think one thing that could go along with what's already been, even if we only end up with these, mainly with these 2 big mega constellations and a handful of others, that are U.S. based, one thing we really have a need for is more Earth station gateways that can handle, the backhaul to the internet from the satellites, the telemetry and control, all that. And it's really incredibly difficult right now to site Earth stations. We need, each of these, the big players are going to need hundreds and hundreds more. So this modernization proposal by the FCC, they ask about that, and I think it's a real opportunity where we would go further, and I think where Joe Armand and I were just on a LEO satellite working group and put out a report suggesting we go further to an approach to light licensing, sort of blanket light licensing using automated database coordination, at least in all the millimeter wave bands above 24, including the UMPHS bands, so-called UMPHS bands these are mobile bands that were auctioned, but are also shared bands with satellites. And in all these millimeter wave bands, because of the propagation, you can, it seems that you could quite easily have an automated database coordination where instead of taking a year-long manual process for each separate Earth station, you can, really get a single nationwide license and then just self-coordinate through the FCC certified database that does the interference analysis, and probably even within 24 hours can deem it either coordinated successfully or not with whatever else is already there. So that's another streamlining thing that's, I think, underappreciated but teed up.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's an NPRM out on that, right?
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point. And I completely agree with what Armand said, although I would say that, even if you assume that there are going to be 2 large players, they have a lot more satellites to launch, right? And would not necessarily discount some of those, quote unquote niche uses that may not be providing global telecommunications, but will have all kinds of use cases that none of us have thought of, right? So that's another aspect as well. So I asked Jay a bit about the spectrum abundance NPRM. I didn't want to press him on specific bands because it's under consideration, it's pending. But really interested in your thoughts. There are some bands in there like 12.2 to 12.7, right? That's directly adjacent to a LEO band. How do you look at the bands in that proposal? Are they enough to meet demand? How do we think about the coexistence with terrestrial and preserving some opportunities for both LEO and terrestrial? So, what are the specifics in terms of that proceeding that you would like to see?
Yeah, I guess I would say I get a little nervous when we talk about meeting demand as though their demand exists just kind of on its own. I think any amount of supply can meet any amount of demand. It's just a matter of what can we actually do with the spectrum at the end of the day. If we make a lot of spectrum available, then there's going to be a lot of things that we can do with satellites. If we don't have the spectrum available, then it's really just going to be a small number of really valuable uses, but there's not going to be the great proliferation of a space economy that we would like to see. So I think we should want to find out what happens when there's just lots of spectrum available all around. On the terrestrial terrestrial front, I think we are starting to see the advantages of more flexibility. I think we should think of flexibility in a more flexible way than even just terrestrial flexibility, that there are now space operators that own terrestrial licenses. There's supplemental coverage from space where you have satellite use of spectrum. There's a license for terrestrial use, and that we should be saying it doesn't have to be an either or anymore, that we can allocate spectrum for both of these uses simultaneously.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I mean, and there are reasons that space and terrestrial are licensed and done separately in terms of spectrum. One is the Orbit Act. There are also good policy reasons, but there are also ways. This is to answer my own question, but there are also ways to find opportunities, right? So in Spectrum Frontiers, several years ago, we did give satellite operators the ability to bid in the auctions. On the theory that what they would be bidding for is interference protection rights. Now, that's not to say, we definitely, in terms of processing rounds in LEO, we absolutely need that in many of these bands. And so it's not to say that you can completely harmonize things, because we definitely need more dedicated spectrum for LEO. But, the FCC, when it does look at opportunities in both regulatory regimes to create opportunities, could really benefit the marketplace.
Yeah, and it's also important to distinguish, there's at least two different main flavors, right? There's fixed satellite spectrum. So when we think of Starlink in the BEAD program, for example, serving households, they're using fixed satellite bands, which are very big but shared. And then there's mobile satellite spectrum, which is what Globalstar, for example, uses when it partners with Apple to allow all the new Apple iPhones to text between two mountaintops on opposite sides of the continent. You can text people. This is not even dependent on a partnership with a mobile carrier. It's simply mobile satellite spectrum used for that purpose, which is what motivated, speaking kind of in the auction category, what motivated SpaceX recently to pay EchoStar $17 billion for this low-band mobile satellite spectrum. So we clearly, when we're talking about these limits on capacity, need more of both. So the Commission Spectrum Abundance proceeding addresses the fixed satellite and proposes to add 500 megahertz to the KU downlink band, which is what Starlink uses to get to homes, for example, which the Rosenworcel FCC had going to the mobile industry, and now it's being turned around and saying, let's give it to satellite instead. It's contiguous, and we fully support that. It's a great idea. Similarly, then you need more uplink, and it's an item at the World Radio Conference for the next one for 2027 to look at the 13.75 to 14 gigahertz band for more small antenna uplink spectrum to increase that in a proportional amount. So the spectrum abundance proceeding is really great in a way, because it's recognizing that the mobile industry is not using the high band spectrum. It doesn't even make sense economically. They should be in the mid-band. They should be below 6 gigahertz, and it's giving more of the upper band spectrum to satellite.
I'll just mention, though, that on the KU band for satellite, the shortage is really on the uplink, not the downlink. So adding more downlink without uplink is, doesn't make as much sense. I mean, they're really, Starlink is really short on the uplink.
I think I want to add one more part of the equation in terms of capacity and market and all of this is we also have now direct consumer, where I think one of the fun things about space for a while is our customers were government, were academia, and they still are, but now we're directly going to the consumer. And it seems that there is an appetite to continue to have services from space. And we see that specifically in also rural areas, and you can see it a lot for the BEAD program and how those grants are coming along, but also just in general, the lack of connectivity in a lot of the country, and where you are meeting that demand and you are having that. So I think in terms of when we think, do we have enough spectrum, it's also thinking about who are we trying to provide the spectrum for and the services for, and why ultimately we're having that business case there.
Yeah, and ultimately, creating new use cases, right, where there are it's not just people, right, devices in rural areas, IoT and so on. Moving along I mentioned it in my opening remarks, but EPFD, it's very technical, and so I hope I don't lose people's interest, because this is actually one of the most important issues to LEO right now. The current rules were created in the late 1990s when, as I mentioned in a commentary, when our biggest problem was the Y2K bug. And at the last World Radio Communication Conference, there were GEO operators. The rules were developed when GEO was, ruling the roost, and there were very few LEO satellites. But at the last World Radio Communications Conference, the GEO operators opposed even studying the band. And so right now the FCC is looking at reforming those rules. We'd be interested in your views on the extent to which that is affecting, the current rules are affecting the ability of the LEO operators to really serve those areas and provide those services, and what sort of changes to those rules we may want to look at that the FCC should adopt following its NPRM.
So actually I moderated a panel at the Spectrum Americas conference about a month ago, and there was a gentleman from Kuiper who sort of suggested that if the rules are implemented as proposed, the capacity of their system would increase by approximately 30%, which is pretty impressive, right, with no additional CapEx. There's also another gentleman on the panel who said, well, if you do that, what'll happen is essentially you'll have more satellites in your arc that you can connect to, right? So that creates more angles that potentially another or follow-on LEO operator would have to coordinate with. So it makes it harder for a follow-on LEO coordinator to launch if one ever tries to. So it kind of cements the existing two operators in place.
One of the other items, and I'll try not to get technical just because this issue does get technical really fast, but one of the items is with the current rules is also not just power levels, but angles that you're providing services. So as you update them, you're more capable of providing service down as you update those angles. And then you have this nifty thing too that allows satellites that are up there to help provide service. So you need less satellites to give that area, whereas before you might have needed some of them to take on the need to provide service there because of the angles that they needed to do. So I'll plug in our video that we did together. So Matt and I did a video together where we explained a little bit more about what that means and how updating them can truly enable more capability, and that 30% number is something that we are seeing, and we should, CCI should have some updated technical numbers in the new year for those who are interested.
So EPFD is the equivalent power flux density, is the ITU's interference metric for sharing between LEOs and GEOs in all those thousands and thousands of megahertz for fixed satellite spectrum, but it's 20 years old, before LEOs were really around or anybody cared. And in the proceeding to update that, to modernize that, the FCC even says, as Armand suggested, that because of EPFD, which is not directly related to measuring harmful interference, the LEOs, their power is restricted, the angles that they can operate at are restricted, and the number of satellites and beams, which may be even more important, number of beams that can service a single location or a single community at one time is limited. So Kuiper, as Armand mentioned, former Kuiper, Amazon, they put in a record, study saying that if you switch to metrics, as the FCC's proposed, to switch to interference metrics that are actually a proxy for actual harmful interference, that you could have 30% more satellites serving a single location, and that overall capacity could be 8x, a 700% increase.
Yeah, and I think to respond to Armand's point, that's a matter of getting the changes to the rules right, which is to say that the rules today are ridiculous. To sort of demonstrate the absurdity of them, the LEOs actually have to power down in many use cases in which there's not actually a GEO present. Just because the rules are like so strict and so the opposite of dynamic, right? And so it is really important to just recognize the need to revisit some of that. FCC is already doing that, and then the next opportunity is going to be at Work 27, which Michael already gave us a preview. The EPFD issue is going to be very active there. There's also came up on an earlier panel. It's going to be in Shanghai, China. That's going to really present a lot of challenges to the U.S. government and allies and partners. I was talking to somebody the other day who had had some conversations with the Chinese government about all the concerns that folks are going to have, operating effectively in China during that. And the representative of the Chinese government said, "Well, you're going to have your own mobile network completely separate from the other mobile networks that you're going to be able to use," and thought that this was going to provide some degree of reassurance about the security of those communications. But that's all to say there are a lot of issues in terms of Work 27. There are spectrum issues. There's EPFD. There's just the ability of the U.S. government to be effective. So we'd be interested in sort of what's top of mind as you think about Work 27 and how we're gonna be effective and what issues we need to address.
Mind if I come back a little bit to EPFD? And this is on WRC. It's not an agenda item. As it was mentioned in the previous panels, even the idea of studying the bands and studying the updating these was kind of pushed aside. LEO interest has managed to make it into a thing where we're now reviewing them, we're looking at them, but it needs to be a coordinated push if we do want to see something move forward, or else we're going to keep seeing it get kicked down, and the next one is in 4 years. The speed that LEO networks are developing, deploying, and everything, I don't think they can afford to do that. So if we want to truly see those updates internationally, it will require that coordination, not just from industry, but also the U.S. government. And so props to FCC on looking at this now, but also coordinating with all the other interested countries who want to see that sort of access in their nations. So I think that's an important caveat to mention, that we shouldn't take it as a given that we will be seeing it at WRC 27, and that it does require that extra effort, and that we need to continue to, if we want to see it, we need to continue to push and continue to advocate that these are old rules, and we have new technologies, and when it comes to protecting GSOs, we also have updated technologies now in the NGSOs to do that. And so I think there's quite a bit of a lift, but I think we can do it, and the U.S. taking leadership on the FCC and PRM has been really good.
Yeah, and I think just to expand on that really briefly, it's not only having the U.S. have the right position on issues like EPFD, it's arriving at positions at an early enough stage in the process that you can build consensus with allies and partners. I was at the National Security Council in the last administration, and I worked on this, and I'm proud of many things, but unfortunately, with the last work, I have all kinds of excuses for it, but we arrived at our position very late, and so hopefully that's something where the current administration can really get it right in terms of getting those positions early enough to actually persuade other countries and regions. So, but I turn to Armand. Any thoughts on this?
Sure. Let me just a very, very high-level thought here. Is they have to keep in mind that 70% of the Earth is water. So the LEO operators have to make their business case off pretty much 30% of the land mass. And then you rule out countries like Russia, China right now, maybe you're down to 20%. So in other words, 80% of their coverage area is almost useless, which means that any efficiency they can get out of getting the spectrum rules right, getting the power rules right, is just critically important for making the business case close. And so it's very important that we have things harmonized across countries as much as possible. We should probably have WRC like every 6 months, as opposed to every 4 years. But seriously, the LEO technology is moving very quickly, and the rules really haven't caught up.
Well, it shows how important satellite issues are. I think they're roughly 85% of satellite issues are 85% of the agenda for the next World Radio Conference, which is really unprecedented. And there's some great items, like, for example, in the spectrum abundance proceeding at the FCC that we were talking about, there's 1,000 megahertz of spectrum for high-capacity uplink from 51.4 to 52.4. That's also on the WRC agenda. And so, it was a study item. And so to the extent that these things can get pushed forward, and there's several like that would actually really help our LEO industry, the U.S. LEO industry, above all. And so it'll be important to get that consensus and push it early.
But there's really only, when it comes down to it, this is maybe one of the other challenges, is that there's really 2 countries doing LEO. That's the U.S. and China. And then you have Europe, who kind of wants to do it, and have this thing called OneWeb, which doesn't really, sort of up there. You start just basically trying to stop things, right, so that maybe they can catch up. But you don't really have a lot of countries with deep buy-in. And I think that's one of the challenges. It's not like cellular mobile, where every country has their own operators and their own deployment, and they're a little bit more committed.
Yeah, I mean, I think the buy-in should hopefully be, and this is something that we all need to do a better job of, the buy-in should be all of the incredible services that are available, right, in terms of serving people in rural areas, connecting people, in areas of rural Africa that there's no way that even a mobile network would get there. So, well, I really want to thank our panel. We could nerd out on this all day. But we're going to have one more panel before the reception on technological innovations in space and LEO. Zana Shank is going to moderate, and I'll let her introduce the panelists. But should be really interesting looking at some of the actual technology that we're seeing in LEO emerge that we should be really excited about. So, thank you.
We got to be sustainable. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our closing panel. My name is Jana Schenk. It is an honor and privilege to be here today. I am a senior associate with CSIS's Strategic Technologies Program, and want to thank you for staying with us for a way to wrap up this rainy Tuesday. And it's perfect, actually, because if the novel Tuesdays with Morrie taught us anything about Tuesdays, they're all about reflection. And what better way to reflect on low Earth orbit with a panel with such an esteemed crew assembled here. So, over the last decade, LEO has pulled off quite a transformation. What used to be a niche domain for scientific missions and a handful of defense assets has now become a critical layer of global digital infrastructure. We're witnessing rapid advancements in massive constellations, AI-enabled space operations, and emerging direct-to-device connectivity. And you'll hear more about that today. These capabilities promise extraordinary benefits, but they also come with a complex array of policy, regulatory, and geopolitical issues. And another part we don't talk about as much is space data ethics. LEO is becoming the real-time nervous system of the digital world, and the data that's flowing through it is its lifeblood. And space data may not be personal data, your personal browser history, but it's still incredibly consequential in forming climate models, disaster response, national security decisions, and driving commercial markets. And if that data is biased or misinterpreted, even the smartest systems can make mistakes at a global scale. So today, we are discussing not just what we build in LEO, but how do we build it responsibly and with trust baked in right at the start. And we're very fortunate to have a distinguished group of experts, former White House and DoD officials who have shaped US policy, as well as leaders in the commercial space industry who are driving innovation on the front lines. And our goal today is to explore together how does tech innovation in policy interact on this fast-moving train, and to leave our audience with some actionable steps, and all before we adjourn for happy hour. No pressure. I'll introduce now our fantastic panelists, Dr. Diane Howard, former Director for Commercial Space Policy in the White House, National Space Council. Also, Ms. Kara Azakar, the Vice President for Regulatory and Public Policy at Iridium. Dr. Cheryl Genko, Global Deputy CTO and VP at Advanced Technology at Ericsson. And Dr. Eric Berger, Research Director at Virginia Tech's Commonwealth Cyber Initiative and former Assistant Director at the White House's Office of Science and Technology Policy. So we're going to start now on the big picture and look at how do you all see LEO constellations reshaping digital infrastructure, and what are your opinions on the biggest innovations in LEO technologies that are shaping the market today? Is the real game changer D2D connectivity? Is it next-gen wireless? Is it AI-driven space operations, or something else?
Well, I'll start because I'm with Ericsson, and as some of you may know, Ericsson is a 5G vendor in the United States, a leading 5G vendor in the United States. And you might, actually someone from CSIS said, well, I don't know if Ericsson has anything to say about LEO, and we certainly do, because we have a number of things. So if you think about Ericsson, the way it operates and the way it designs its technology, it designs it with tech partners like Qualcomm, with Intel, and we are very, very strong in our standards bodies. And so that's also what is needed in LEO. So from that viewpoint, we can say that, you know, the access to the backhaul or the fixed wire, the middle mile with a LEO constellation is really going to increase the scale, increase the subscriptions for 6G, the crosslinks, the direct-to-device waveforms, which we've already demonstrated and are actually in existence since 3G, are part of the ecosystem for the Gs, for the telecom industry. So I see not only all the things that you just mentioned, and you forgot quantum, by the way, but
thank you.
But certainly I see that the scale is what's necessary. I think it was Jay who was trying to say earlier that there were three pieces. There was cost, technology, and accessibility, and that's what's going to happen as 6G comes out stronger and unifies non-terrestrial networks with terrestrial networks. And so that scale is going to drive the costs down, and that's going to make it more accessible across the world.
Thank you, Cheryl. Diane, thoughts?
Sure. Let's see if I can get this to work. And I have to say, I'm not just a former, I actually do things now as well. Anyway, so I really don't come from the spectrum world, per se. Everything I know because I'm a friend of Audrey Allison, so, but I'm not the best pupil. But I do come from the sustainability and the space traffic coordination world, and I will tell you that AI is an incredible enabler in that aspect, and I think that is a big game changer. So how do we use AI in LEO? For one, we have autonomous maneuvering, and that's made a lot more efficiency possible. particularly for these very large operators. But we also use machine learning and AI to anomaly spot, and that's got a profound impact on our space safety. And then there's more. I mean, LEO is a very it's getting more congested, but not everywhere. But as you get lower, there's more happening, and that's had impacts on the launch community. And I do recognize this is not your jam here, but it has made it very difficult. And so there are companies that are using AI to help them cull through that data to create more manageable windows, particularly for newer entrants into the launch field where you have lesser data. So you don't have the ability to find the same reliabilities. But then there's also even AI projects right now to go through all of the launch and now reentry data, because uncontrolled reentries are a thing and controlled reentries are also a thing. And so they're starting to use all of AI to better provide metrics for the flight safety analysis. And again, you all need that launch to get your birds up there. So those are just a couple of things that come to top of mind. Thanks.
Thank you, Diane. Eric, over to you.
Yeah, sure. So, and we heard it a little bit on the last panel even, there's this non-terrestrial network thing, and it's competing with this terrestrial network thing. And really a lot of research and a lot of what Ericsson's doing is on integrating the networks. It's on the one hand, it's an active area of academic research, which means not totally for prime time, and yet enough of it is for prime time that it's getting baked into the 5G standards, with the goal of, from a consumer's perspective, a business perspective, a mission perspective, connectivity is just there. Some things making that happen besides the technology for sharing, I keep coming back to Crosslink. Because without Crosslink, a lot of people are thinking, how much compute, like how much AI processing can we put on a satellite? But if you think about it, with Crosslink, that's operating at the speed of light. By the way, when we talk fiber, that's 6/10 the speed of light. Actually can ship data faster. And if you think especially about rural connectivity, polar connectivity, in the bands we're talking about, that's about the same distance that we would have like a cell tower. So we actually can route things faster in space. Remember, it used to be, I don't want to do space, it's slow and limited, and the latency is incredibly big. Well, now we're like, I need it fast, I'll go use non-terrestrial.
Fascinating. Kara?
Yeah, so I work for Iridium. I see friendly faces here, but for those that don't know Iridium, we're a low Earth orbit, non-geostationary satellite constellation. We've been in service for 25 years, one of the first to use crosslinks so that we could ground data faster, cover the entire globe, even the polar regions, which we were the only ones to do for quite a long time. What I found most interesting, and the reason I really wanted to participate in this panel, was because it was about LEO, but not just about LEO broadband, and that's where Iridium plays. So Iridium started out in the 90s as a satellite phone company, sort of a land mobile play, and has grown from there. We've refreshed the whole constellation, and IoT is actually our largest growing area of business. We are the network. We enable the applications that connect to our network, but we have over 500 partners that build and deploy those things like autonomous systems, edge computing, all of the above. And our newest growing area of business is position, navigation, and timing, an alternative and a complement to GPS from low Earth orbit. So it's 1,000 times stronger, more resilient to spoofing and jamming due to the cryptographic techniques that we use, and also due to the fact that there are multiple satellites moving overhead rather than just one. So innovation in LEO is certainly Iridium's I don't know if you could say a company's middle name. I don't know what phrase to use. But that's certainly something, that we pride ourselves on, and that we continue to innovate on our network. The other area of innovation for Iridium is that we have been participating in 3GPP, and we'll be having a standards-based product coming out next year through the narrowband IoT NTN release 19. And we're very excited for what that will bring in terms of smaller form factor, smaller cost, more devices that that connect to Iridium's network so that more partners can innovate and bring more solutions.
Definitely want to circle back to you to talk about IoT and D2D connectivity. But first, Eric, a question for you. Earlier, we had discussed today the national security implications for LEO. I'd be curious to hear your take in looking at next-gen technologies and the national security nexus there. What are your concerns and then areas where you see opportunity?
Yeah, well, two things. One is the clutter, the space junk. It is getting to be a kind of a dangerous area, real estate, so to speak. Whether we're talking about just the natural decay of things having space junk or deliberate acts. These are things that are now becoming a cause of concern. The other is cyber. We think of cybersecurity, how do we keep the ransomware out of our, computers at work and in the hospitals. But at the end of the day, it's like, all right, well, we refresh the computer and reboot it. It's an awfully long way to go to press the reset switch. So, cyber is also another area that, and it is a national security issue because even though we think of, military satellites, whatever, if the oil fields turn off that you're servicing, that's a bad day for everybody. So, it's not just military applications that we need to be mindful of.
Thank you. Diane, in Eric's comments about orbital debris being one of the largest looming national security threats, any thoughts on the sustainability security aspect of that you'd like to share?
How much time do we have? So sustainability is a little bit out of favor right now, but really I can make a great business case for you that if we don't think about it, you're not going to have much of a business case. So I like to call it mutually assured benefit. It's in all of your benefit to think about these things. And it is true that it is a big issue. So, when I said I have a life now after, there is life after DC. And one of the things that we're working on is how to approach this operational area, that LEO, which is increasingly populated, but it's not one size fits all. The different parts of LEO are different, and so trying to come up with a framework or an approach. I think framework sounds a little bit legalistic, and I'm not talking about that, but more of an operational approach that allows us to look at who's going to which location. Is there a reason for them to be there? Do they need to be there? And what are the capabilities that they have? If it's a particularly congested area, should we perhaps be thinking about requiring a little bit more? And so that's some of there are some creative ways that we're starting to approach the whole debris issue. And it fortunately is something that's in everybody's consciousness. I will say, we've talked a lot about the FCC today, and the FCC did lean forward and go to the 5-year rule. I was very pleased to see that myself. And I think that there is this increased awareness, which can only be helpful. And if we have to call it by a different name than sustainability, then so be it. Better business model.
Mutually assured benefit, you heard it here first. Moving on.
The industry does see it that way, though. I can say from our perspective as Iridium, Iridium was the victim of a collision. A rogue Russian satellite crashed into Iridium in 2009, resulting in a lot of debris that we have tracked. And we view ourselves as a leader in this area, mostly because of the best practices that have been created out of that experience. And we do think, we have many colleagues within the LEO space that come to participate in such best practices and I think lead the world in doing so from the US. I think the challenge is the sort of global concern and how we deal with adversary countries that may not want to collaborate with us on such best practices or operations is really the challenge. But it's space safety and it's critical for operating in low Earth orbit.
It's actually a lingua franca. Also, it's something that we have in common and something that adversaries and us alike, we're all working in the same physical, subject to the same physical laws. So what's a hazard for our assets is a hazard for theirs. So that is like a bridge over some troubled water.
Well said. I'd like to move us forward to talking about direct-to-device connectivity. It's obviously emerging as a game changer for LEO networks with terrestrial applications like emergency communications, public safety, support in rural remote connectivity, equity with access, IoT, and other consumer and commercial applications. A question for Karen, also to Cheryl. What technical breakthroughs are enabling D2D connectivity from LEO satellites? How do they differ from terrestrial satellite-to-ground station architectures? And what role do you think AI and edge computing can play in optimizing D2D performance?
Well, I'll just start. So we've done a number of experiments. So, I think the very first guy was saying that there's not engineers in the room, but I have a PhD in electrical engineering, so I don't know. And I'm here. But we'll discuss calculus later. So, suffice to say, we've done an experiment which was really very interesting. That was a direct-to-device with Thales and with Qualcomm, where although we didn't fly it, we used a channel emulator. We used prototype devices, prototype chipsets, and we showed the resiliency of a system that could make use of 5G direct-to-device. And that was really an important ecosystem development because it showed how, the technology players working together can really innovate and really establish new ways of operating to drive more connectivity. And, I think you were talking about it, Eric, about not so much collapsing, but to unifying terrestrial networks. That's the stuff that, AT&T, T-Mobile, Verizon, unifying that with non-terrestrial networks for users. And so, from my perspective, I see a lot of that. And then one of the other things I'd like to say is that I was previously a consultant up until last month to DARPA's director. And the national security implications for some of the things that we've just discussed today are significant. And I'll leave that now up to you to take on.
Well, I'm not quite going to start there, but I will talk about, from Iridium's perspective, the innovation for D2D in what we're doing was the ability to fit a standardized solution within our existing less than 9 megahertz of spectrum. And then participating in the 3GPP process and allowing our specifications and to get into that in short order in order to be able to be part of the current release. And that, I think, is the challenge, is if D2D is going to be a standardized product, which that's where Iridium believes it's going, having the 3GPP standards being part of it and keeping up with it and it keeping up with the technology is the key to the technological innovation. Excuse me, it's been a long day. The edge computing and the other pieces of it, I think I already spoke to in my opening remarks, because that's already part of some of the solutions that we already have, but we believe that having standards-based solution will simply enable more of that to occur on the network.
Just another point on that. The increase in the number of academic papers coming out of China related to space domain awareness has skyrocketed in the last short time. I don't know how, 2 years or less, right? And what that says is that they are actively studying, producing documents, not just for the sake of doing that, but to influence the standards. And so the 3GPP standards that are coming up, the work, the WRC 27, that coincides, 2027 coincides with the 6G standards, release 19, is it, Eric, I think? Release 19, and that's a big deal. And so to your point of getting our countries and all of the other countries are together before the work and before 3GPP release 19 is absolutely valuable and essential, Matt.
I do want to drill further in the D2D connectivity, but Cheryl, because you mentioned the implications of WRC, I am curious how you think we should be thinking about these developments, and Eric, your thoughts as well in the context of future international negotiations or larger thematic observations you might offer for WRC 27, etc.
Yeah, thanks. So on the one hand, the U.S. and China are the leading LEO. Actually, we're right now the leading, but China's, doing their best to catch up. And as we also heard, that may be about it. And remember that the United States and China are not the only spacefaring nations. So we do have some interesting aligned national security concerns. That said, there are a few bones of contention between the U.S. and China. One of them is somewhat related to LEO, but just in general, and it's going to be a big thing at the work, is the midband. Because for some reason, Huawei wants to populate the whole world with radios right in the middle of our military radar bands. I can't imagine why they would want to do that. If people know what my work was, I know that we can move some systems out of the band. I also know there are some systems we can't move out of the band. The Next G Alliance, like literally right now, as in the last draft came out this morning, is working on spectrum proposals, both for US consumption, but the point of the Next G Alliance is to influence what's coming out in IMT 2030, and now with eyes to the work. So I'll also put in the pitch there. We need consensus in the United States, probably in parallel as we need consensus throughout the world. If we have interests saying everything should go to mobile, everything should go to satellite, then some of our adversaries, who I wouldn't say they're buying votes by, to use a term we've used here, by busing people to vote, but bringing in a lot of countries because it's country vote in the work. We have to be preparing our own alliances. That said, so yes, China would probably like to limit what Starlink and I guess LEO now can do, but they also want to protect Baidu. So on the one hand, things will probably not be too dramatic. One of the items, 1.5, is what do we do about unlicensed, unregulated Earth stations, which is another way for saying a Starlink receiver, an Iridium phone. Totally get, and I'm somewhat sympathetic that, a country does get to say what goes on within their country. But there are two literal corner cases. One is the corner case. You're in the neighboring country. Do you really turn off service for that user? And what if you basically are from a block of countries that say, people ought to be able to get real information. The best way of doing that is on the internet, versus a country that wants to make sure that everything is monitored and censored. And that, from their perspective, that is an issue of national security. They want to protect their citizens from bad, evil thoughts like open and free discussion. So that's going to be some major things going on in Shanghai.
Thank you. Any thoughts, Cheryl?
No, I think Eric definitely covered it. I think the supplemental coverage from space that came out, that was a good start, right? I think that looking at ways to use spectrum from a systems perspective. I mean, we were talking about earlier, the groups were talking about all these different problems with, coverage, or not even coverage, but from space junk and everything else. And I think that we have to look at it from a systems perspective and an ecosystems perspective. Again, to Matt's point about getting ready for the work and ready for 3GPP, the Chinese have a unified approach to telecom, and it's a telecom as an infrastructure, right? And we have a lot of players. But we have to, herd the cats in the United States and try to get a place, a statute, something that will enable this prior to these very important international conversations that have to happen.
Thank you. I'd like to hop back to D2D and also policies related to spectrum and ask for your insights, Kara, regarding what reforms you would like to see or regard as most urgent to enable transformative innovation.
Yeah, so specific reforms are a little bit tricky to get to. I will get to that. But I think the most important part about any reforms or policy making in order to compete with China is that we have a robust and diverse space economy. So there's a lot of discussion about a lot of the new entrants that are coming in. Obviously, Iridium has been around a long time. We are not one of the new entrants. And in promoting, as the US should, new entrants into the space economy, I just urge caution to make sure that you don't undermine the existing space economy that already exists. That's the only way that we're going to get to a place of beating China at the space gate race is because they are coming at it from new, all new. And we have an existing layer that already exists that's innovative and resilient and redundant and invested in that can be used to leverage our ability to win that race. And that's super important. So that includes things like ensuring that spectrum is available to multiple users, multiple end use cases in a variety of different bands, and not just simply to the highest bidder. That's why spectrum auctions haven't been available in satellite spectrum, is because that wasn't the model that the US government believed was going to be successful, and it still is not the means that is going to be successful. So spectrum needs to get out into the satellite marketplace, and it needs to be available to many, many operators, I think is the most important reform and movement we can make. Streamlining licensing is very important. The amount of time, effort, and money it costs to license in the United States is not ideal at this time. Again, exercise caution in doing so, that you don't undermine the existing operators that are already in the band, but there's a lot that can be done there to make that go faster and cost less, so that existing companies can innovate and new entrants can also become part of that operation. And then the last one is space safety. I think that is a very important part of it, making that clear and distinguishable from other countries, and allowing the US to lead in that area is going to create a stable US economy in LEO, in space in general, because in order to invest in very expensive assets that get launched into space and you don't have control over them necessarily, is having practices that all of the operators are operating in that protect each other's assets as much as they protect their own. So while we do have control over our assets through TT&C, we can't control what others are doing. And so having best practices that are adhered to across the globe, not just by a group of operators, are super critical for space safety.
Excellent clarion call for leading with global standards and protecting those engines of industry. I'd like to move us forward to talk about the regulatory environment, which is fragmented across multiple agencies. And Diane, ask for your insights on what do you perceive as the biggest policy and regulatory challenges in this emerging commercial satellite market?
Well, I'm with Kara. I don't want to tear down legacy things that work from a policy perspective and from a regulatory perspective. So, I've worked on this set of issues for a while. And so finding a way to build upon existing expertise and the existing system, because it's very disruptive. If you throw it all out, then what? I think we've had a taste. Disruption is sometimes uncomfortable and unpleasant. However, that said, I don't know that I would say fragmented. I would say that, I read the space modernization, NPRM, with a lot of joy in my heart. And yeah, there's a lot of questions, and that's a good thing. They should be asking these questions. And some of the answers are going to kind of take some of the things that they're like, oh, we want to do it all. They won't be able to do it all, but they're asking, in my opinion, the right questions. And I think looking at that NPRM, I could see where it built off of a lot of the policy development efforts of the last few years, with taking a step back and looking at things in a more incremental manner which allows it to scale. So I think that's a very, very good thing. You talk about space safety, and this is a very important thing. Well, yeah, and we heard Jay earlier today talk about the importance of making sure that our oversight system is robust enough to meet that equivalency standard, whatever it may end up being, and if that even makes it through the hopper in the European Union, but we want to be able to have open markets because that's a very important thing. So I would say that it's not completely fragmented, but what it is in transition. And I think one of the biggest challenges to this time of transition and reform is not necessarily the speed with which we do things, but the coordination that we exercise when we do them. And so right now we have this effort with the space modernization and PRM, but there's also an EO that came out in August directing the Department of Commerce to work on some of these issues that are exactly what that VTSS is about. So finding ways to manage that shared space, that shared authority and that shared space. And I think that's crucially important. So I would invite any of you that didn't know about it to go on the Office of Space Commerce website. And it's a virtual meeting. It's tomorrow from 10 till 12. But you have equities in all of this because it's going, what they come up with is going to be adjacent to what you work with at the FCC. And at the end of the day, you see that in the NPRM as well. They talk about how are we going to work with other departments and agencies, and he mentioned looking for the owner-operator sharing ephemerides and also collision avoidance. Doesn't get into too many specifics. Share with whom and collision avoidance how. However, some of that work is already being done in other parts of the executive branch, so it's very, very important that this coordination effort continues. That's my 2 cents.
Thank you. I have a question both for Cheryl and Diane. It's, I guess, a double tap on your comments on the type of regulatory approach that is most salutary. Do you think that it's a hybrid of a light touch and then something that's more targeted? Should it be purely targeted or purely light touch to allow these entities to thrive when we think about 5 years from now, what we would like to see in this landscape?
I was also a regulator. I was at NTIA for a period of time, and so I am very. I have opinions on that for sure. And one of my opinions is, can't we just scrap the entire existing table of spectrum allocations and start over because here's the thing is I'm an engineer, and so I look at it from the standpoint of, wow, what kind of innovations could we have if we could do that all over again? Like if you could imagine a world where you could purposefully know everything you know today about technology and where it could be going and where it's been and redo that. That to me is really a futuristic study that I'd love to do at some point. But it would probably make Charles Cooper die.
So here's the thing, and I'm not saying you shouldn't do that, and I think there's a place for that. I think you have to plan for it, was what I was saying. But I am a big believer in, light touch doesn't mean no touch. Right. And what's light today maybe doesn't stay light eventually as things mature or they get more specific. But I think you start out without getting too prescriptive for good reason. This is a panel about innovation. Right. And you need to give it room.
You need to give it room totally, and you need to use the technology tools you have. And everybody, can't fall over themselves without saying the words AI, right? And so that's why I was kind of joking with you about quantum, but I'm also involved in quantum communication. So, but suffice to say, seriously, AI provides us with tools and capabilities that 25 years ago we probably couldn't have even understood. And so that's why I come at it from that point of view. And so I think that the space coverage piece, where we have, a coordinated and also a very interesting way of approaching different spectrum policies to take into account these different uses. I think that's really, really important because it's not an all for one and
not a zero-sum game.
Yeah, not a zero-sum game. Exactly.
Yes. Appreciate both of your thoughtful perspectives here. We've reached the point in our program for the lightning round. I'm going to ask each of our contestants to please share what is their top priority that they would like the audience to walk away with. What would they want senior policymakers to have imparted upon from this panel of how to harness the power of innovation and have leadership in LEO? Eric?
Well, thanks for the lead up. So I don't have to explain why I want this. Is FCC rules tend to be looking at the worst case ever, and they put people into, or services into a box, and that leaves a lot at the margins. Sometimes the worst case happens, but most of the time it doesn't. So in a satellite panel, I'll talk about 12 gigahertz. When it's a day like today, you actually can crank up the power and you're not going to interfere. When it's a day like yesterday, the secondary users need to be quiet. So moving to more dynamic rules, because yes, we know a lot today, but 20 years from now, your daughter's going to be sitting here saying, I hate it when mom was at NTIA and she did the thing, and yeah, she said we know what we know now, but she doesn't know anything because we have AI, we have the products from the Spectrum Challenge and all that.
And quantum.
More flexibility.
Yeah,
quantum.
so Eric knows about my daughter. She has a quantum startup, so that's why he's giving me jazz right now.
That's perfect. Kara?
I already, I think, said my policy goals, but just a robust, diverse space economy is the key.
Precision, love it.
I think definitely preparing the policymakers and the government should prepare very thoroughly for the work and for 3GPP in a serious manner to combat adversaries.
Thank you, Cheryl. Diane?
I think commitment to our long-term planning, and I said it before, coordination. I think once we, make that commitment, then we have to coordinate across the government and with industry.
Please join me in thanking our fantastic panelists for this fascinating closing discussion. I'd like to welcome back Lauren Williams for some brief concluding remarks before adjourning our party. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shanna. Okay. I think this is on. And very brief concluding remarks after a really fascinating and I think perfect panel to end off our conversation today. So just by way of broader thanks to all of you, thank you for coming to this program today for several panels and to the incredible experts that we had join us to cover a huge range of topics. And as much as we've scratched the surface, I think we all know that we could probably spend several days digging in on each of these issues. So by way of shameless plug for several ways that you can get more information about all of these topics, through the expertise of the CSIS Strategic Technologies Program, just want to flag that we've had and we will continue to put out episodes of a podcast that is hosted by Matt and myself called Catch Me If You Can. And this week, I think the podcast series will touch on some of the issues we talked about today. So look out for that. That is on Spotify and iTunes and everywhere else you can find podcasts. And then last but not least, we will also be continuing to dive into these issues in written form, in the form of a report on all of these topics related to the LEO satellite ecosystem, and you can look out for that in early next year. And with that, most importantly, the reception starts now. Thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you at future events. Thank you.